Remember how I made the tailgate on the back of that? What people didn't know the backstory was, if you look at the very first scene where we find the body next to the shipping container in the weeds, you'll see the tailgate from the truck.
For nearly a decade, Ian Roussel built the kind of cars most people wouldn't even know how to begin making. His world was simple: a desert garage, raw metal, strange ideas, and the freedom to build whatever he wanted. Full Custom Garage turned that world into television and made Ian a familiar face to millions of viewers. Then his life took a turn nobody watching the show could have predicted. The shop closed. Ian moved away. And the man who had spent years creating incredible machines suddenly found himself rebuilding his own life. So what happened to Ian Roussel? And what forced him to leave the world he had built? Join us as we uncover the full story. How the desert changed everything. The story of how Ian Roussel ended up with a television show is one of those Hollywood accidents that could only have happened to someone who was completely indifferent to Hollywood. He was not pitching ideas to networks or positioning himself for anything beyond the next build sitting in his shop. He was just working. His television career started unexpectedly when someone asked him to make a DVD in 2003, and now Full Custom Garage is in its 8th season. It's pretty crazy, since no one ever envisioned this. The footage from that DVD reached MAV-TV Motorsports Network, and the years of conversations, pilot episodes, and negotiations that followed produced something unusual in the automotive television landscape. Full Custom Garage premiered on MAV-TV on March 28, 2014, and immediately distinguished itself from everything else in the genre by refusing to be what the genre typically was. There were no staged rivalries or dramatic reveals where a client reacts to a car for the first time with tears and a hug while swelling music plays. There were also no manufactured deadline crises, just Ian Roussel in the Mojave Desert, treating sheet metal like clay and imagination like the only blueprint he needed. The show ran through 6 seasons and 69 episodes on MAV-TV, then made its way to Discovery and eventually Amazon Prime through the spin-off Custom Cars, Lead Sleds, Back from the Dead with Ian Roussel. The builds were genuinely extraordinary. Chopped Packards, channeled frames, experimental trikes, an electric dune buggy that Ian built from an industrial motor years before EV swaps became a trend anyone was talking about. Fans drove out to Mojave specifically to see his shop, snapping photos outside his workshop, in the way that people visit a place they feel they already know. The show's IMDb rating reflected a viewer response that went beyond casual appreciation. But behind the romanticized desert facade, the reality behind the cameras was considerably harder than any episode ever showed. And the gap between what audiences were watching and what Ian was actually living was building pressure that would eventually have to go somewhere. What television does to a craftsman. Custom fabrication does not follow a schedule. Anyone who has ever spent serious time in a real workshop, not a television workshop, understands this intuitively. The design changes when you start cutting. The material behaves differently than the plan said it would. A problem that should take 2 hours takes 8, or reveals a deeper problem that needs to be solved first. Inspiration arrives at midnight and dies if you force it into a daytime slot. The creative process in metalwork is resistant to the kind of structure that television production demands. Ian Roussel spent nearly a decade trying to reconcile these two incompatible realities. Episodes had to fit a specific format. Scenes required retakes to get coverage. Storylines needed pacing that served a viewer sitting at home rather than the actual logic of how a build evolved. Over time, the gap between how Ian naturally worked and how the production needed him to work became a daily friction that accumulated in ways that were not visible on screen, but were very visible to the people inside the shop. His wife, Jaime, was essential in making any of it function. Originally a hospice nurse who later became a holistic health coach, she handled the operational side of everything the show required. Ian built the cars, while Jaime built the framework that allowed him to keep building them under the pressure of being watched, scheduled, and formatted. Their partnership was the engine of the whole enterprise, but an engine running at that sustained load has maintenance requirements that do not appear in any production budget. The Mojave Desert itself was a particular challenge that most viewers sitting in comfortable homes watching the show never fully reckoned with. Ian was working in a shop in the Mojave, in conditions that routinely reached extreme temperatures, with the physical demands of metalwork, the grinding, the welding, the sustained concentration required to shape material by hand. Happening in that environment day after day, season after season, production cycle after production cycle. The desert that gave the show its visual poetry was also extracting a physical cost that Ian was paying in real time while the cameras captured only the finished work. "I love what I do," he told the Spokesman Review. "The funny thing is that I'm not particularly into cars, but it's my addiction to making them and creating all of these shapes." The bill for all of that sustained effort arrived between late 2022 and early 2023, and it arrived in the most physical and irreversible way possible. The desert collecting its debt. Ian Roussel collapsed from heat exhaustion between late 2022 and early 2023, and the collapse was serious enough to produce documented kidney damage. This was not a close call that resolved itself after a day of rest and fluids. The kidneys are not organs that quietly absorb a one-time incident and return to full function without consequence. Heat-related kidney injury is a condition that reflects cumulative stress on the body over time, a system pushed to its limit, finally failing to compensate. The desert had been collecting its debt in small increments for years, and this was the moment it called the full balance due. The collapse happened while Ian was still in the middle of his television commitments, which is perhaps the most revealing detail of the whole episode. A person whose schedule had space in it, whose days were not structured around production timelines and client builds and the sustained physical labor of metalwork in desert heat, would have had some buffer. Ian did not have that buffer. The collapse was the body making a decision the conscious mind had not been willing to make, which is how physical crisis announces itself in people who have overridden their own warning signals for too long. The collapse forced a reckoning that the production schedule had prevented. Ian could not simply return to the same conditions that had produced the crisis, run at the same pace, under the same environmental stress, and expect a different outcome. Something had to change, and that something that changed was his relationship with the platform that had given him his audience and his income for nearly a decade. Jaime's background as a hospice nurse and holistic health coach was almost certainly relevant to how the family navigated the recovery and the decisions that followed it. She had spent her professional life helping people at the most physically and emotionally demanding moments of their existence, and the shift from that role to managing her husband's recovery while simultaneously running the operational side of a television production and a custom fabrication business represents a kind of sustained personal commitment that rarely gets acknowledged in stories about creative professionals. What happened in May 2022, several months before the collapse, had already signaled that the world Ian had built around himself in the desert was under pressure, and the signal arrived in the form of a loss that had nothing to do with television ratings or production schedules. The simultaneous unraveling of multiple things at once. In May 2022, Ian lost his dog, Dude, a constant companion in the Mojave Desert through the years of building and filming, the kind of presence in a workshop that people who work alone understand as something much more than a pet. Dude had been there through the heat and the grinding and the long days when the build was not cooperating, and the deadline was not moving. The loss of a companion like that, in the specific context of that specific life, carries a weight that is disproportionate to what outsiders might assume from the outside. The loss of Dude coincided with the beginning of the health decline that would culminate in the collapse, which meant Ian was carrying personal grief alongside a physical system under increasing stress, inside a production structure that did not have room for either of those things. The Mojave is not a forgiving environment for grief. It is not a forgiving environment for anything that requires slowing down, and Ian had been refusing to slow down for years before the desert made the decision for him. Full Custom Garage had been earning Ian a global audience and steady income since 2014, and stepping away from it was not a simple financial calculation. The show had also become the framework within which his creative work had meaning to people beyond the clients whose cars he was building. It gave the fabrication a context, an audience, a community of people who followed his work closely enough to notice when something was different. Walking away from that meant walking away from a kind of relationship with the people who had been watching since the beginning. In late 2023, Ian stepped away from Full Custom Garage before the network made any decision about the show's future. Unlike many television personalities who cling to their platforms, Ian chose to leave on his own terms. It was a bold decision, considering the show had provided him with a global audience and steady income for nearly a decade. The departure was his choice. That distinction matters enormously because it is the difference between a man whose situation was decided for him and a man who looked at what the show had cost him physically and personally, looked at what continuing would cost him going forward, and made a clear-eyed decision about which price he was no longer willing to pay. In November 2024, Motor Trend Studios shuttered multiple automotive lifestyle productions overnight, leaving many hosts scrambling for alternatives. Ian had already left. His exit was not an emergency response to a network decision, but a deliberate pivot made months before the industry around him collapsed. And then the place that had been his home, his workshop, and his identity for 6 years had to go too. The day the Desert Ranch closed. The Desert Ranch shop in Mojave, California, was not just a location for Full Custom Garage. It was the physical manifestation of everything Ian Roussel had built. The place where the show existed, where the builds happened, where the community of fans who drove out from across the country arrived to take photos, buy merchandise, and feel briefly adjacent to the creative process they had been watching on screen. Walking away from it meant walking away from all of that simultaneously. In September 2024, Ian and Jaime permanently closed the Desert Ranch shop. The closure announcement came through Ian's YouTube channel in a video titled "The End of an Era. Full Custom Ian Says Goodbye to the Desert Ranch." And the title was accurate in a way that simple episode titles rarely are. The Desert Ranch had been their home for 6 years. The Mojave had shaped everything about what the show became and what Ian's creative identity meant to the people who followed it. Leaving it felt, as Ian later described it, like losing part of his own identity. The shop wasn't failing. In fact, it remained respected and productive. But the years of exhaustion, creative pressure, and physical strain had built up to the point where continuing in the same environment no longer felt sustainable. That detail, that the shop was not failing, is the one that separates this closure from a conventional business story. This was not a forced exit. It was a voluntary one. made by someone who had looked honestly at what the environment was doing to him and concluded that staying was not compatible with continuing to exist as a functional person. The heat that had damaged his kidneys was still there. The physical demands of metalwork in desert conditions were still there. The production pressure was gone, but the environmental pressure was not. And Ian's body had already demonstrated that it could not indefinitely absorb both. The move to Arizona represented something Ian described as a personal and professional reset. A new environment, a new shop, a new chapter that was not defined by the television era or by the specific geography that had produced it. His YouTube channel, Full Custom Ian, which he had quietly launched in January 2023, months before his network exit, was already functioning as the new platform for long-form content. The episodes, ranging from 18 minutes to over an hour, showed the actual iterative process of custom fabrication, including the mistakes, the miscuts, and the moments of rethinking that television had always edited out. Himi expanded her role in the new operation to include producing, editing, and narrative coordination, and the output was remarkable. 26 substantial episodes in the first year of the YouTube channel tripled the pace of what the television show had managed within its production constraints. The freedom of the digital platform allowed them to show the work the way the work actually happens, without the overlay of entertainment structure that television had always imposed. So, where is Ian Roussel now? A new direction. The new Arizona shop is running. The YouTube channel is growing. Ian Roussel is still building cars with the same obsessive commitment to craft that he brought to every season of Full Custom Garage. And the audience that found him through television has followed him into the digital space with the kind of loyalty that reflects genuine connection rather than passive viewership. When you watch someone make something for nearly a decade, when you understand the way they think about a problem, the aesthetic decisions they make at each step of the process, you do not simply stop caring because the channel changed. What Ian's story reveals about the intersection of creative work and television, though, is something that the industry rarely acknowledges openly. The authenticity that made Full Custom Garage compelling was not a production decision. It was the natural expression of a man who was genuinely doing the thing the show claimed to document. When production pressure began to distort that authenticity, when the show needed Ian to work in ways that conflicted with how actual custom fabrication works, the thing that made the show worth watching was the thing being compromised. The crisis that followed was not incidental to that tension. It was its direct product. Ian Roussel spent years building a reputation in the automotive world using raw metal and relentless determination, and the television platform gave that reputation a global reach that no amount of workshop excellence could have generated independently. That is the genuine gift the show provided, and Ian has acknowledged it without bitterness. But the show extracted something in return: years of physical output in an environment that damaged his health, creative pressure that accumulated beyond what any individual system can sustainably absorb, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing your most personal work inside someone else's production structure for a decade. The closure of the Desert Ranch shop was described in fan communities as the end of an era, and it was. But the era that ended was the television era, the period when Ian Roussel's work existed primarily within the frame of a network show and a geographic identity. What has replaced it is, by every measure Ian has offered in his YouTube content and his public statements, something that feels more genuinely like what he actually wanted to be doing all along. The long-form videos that show mistakes, the builds that take as long as they actually take, the creative process documented without the requirement that it be entertaining at every moment, the absence of artificial suspense. "We're not entertainers," he told the Spokesman Review in 2021, while the show was still running. We're car people making the coolest cars that we can possibly make. The sentence reads differently now than it did then. At the time, it sounded like modesty. In retrospect, it sounds like a man describing the gap between what the show required him to be and what he actually was, and quietly, accurately, predicting that the gap would eventually become impossible to sustain. It did, and survived it. He rebuilt in Arizona, with Jaime beside him as she has always been, building cars on his own terms for the audience that followed him there. The tragedy of Ian Roussel is real. The health crisis, the kidney damage, the loss of Dude, the closure of the shop that built his public identity, the departure from the show that gave him his platform. None of those losses are small. All of them cost something that cannot be simply recovered by pivoting to YouTube and launching a new chapter. But the man who emerged from all of it is still making cars, and the cars are still extraordinary. Does Ian Roussel's story change how you think about what television costs, the people who make it possible? And do you think the YouTube version of Full Custom Ian is a worthy successor to what the show was at its best? And if you have been following the new channel, which build has hit you hardest so far? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.